Juvenile Justice Association, and on behalf of the association, I want to thank you for your participation in this installment of the NJJA webinar series. With the help and support of the Sheryl Foundation, NJJA has begun expansion of its three core values of education, leadership, and collaboration through a series of webinars and online resources for juvenile justice professionals in Nebraska. For more information on upcoming educational opportunities, please go to njja.org and sign up for our mailing list. I have a couple of housekeeping items before we begin today. Please make sure your name appears on the right-hand side of your screen as we are noting attendance for this live webinar session. This webinar is approved for 1 hour of MCLE credit, ongoing CEUs for LMHPs, and 1 hour of criminogenic hours. In order to obtain these credits, your name must appear on that right-hand side. For criminogenic hours, the webcast must be viewed live. Also, please utilize the chat function on the right side of your screen for all questions. In the interest of time, we ask that you save all your questions for the times outlined by our facilitator. This webinar is being recorded as a resource and will be able to be accessed through njja.org in the near future. For more information about that, it will be sent out through our mailing list. Since 1988, Sheryl Overby has helped families impacted by sexual abuse, including abused children, children with problematic sexual behaviors, caregivers, and adults. She spent 15 years as an RSAFE therapist at Lutheran Family Services and now leads the RSAFE training and consultation program. She provides individual and family therapy and private practice at Woodhaven Counseling, and Ms. Overby's website, SherylOverby.com, and professional Facebook, Sheryl Overby Counseling, have many articles and resources available. Sheryl, thank you for bringing this information to us, and the conference is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. And if you ever need a second job, you can always become a sports announcer. Okay, so good morning, everyone. It is almost noon, and it's cloudy here in Omaha, but it is officially spring, so we all should be happy about that. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. I'm just going to proceed. This is a little unusual. I'm usually doing conferences and that kind of thing live, so oh shucks, it says my network connectivity was lost, and it's reloading here real quick. So let me get started with, hopefully you have some of the handouts there that you can also access. And so here's the first picture. This is me in 1987, and yes, the perm and the black acid wash jeans are real. I was originally a juvenile court probation officer before I became a therapist, and back in those days, the juvenile court decided to assign caseworkers to all the abuse and neglect cases, and so I was providing case management along with a Department of Health and Human Services caseworker for mostly sexual abuse cases that I had at the time. And we just did the best that we could. We didn't have a lot of resources, and we didn't know all that much about sexual abuse, but we still, plodded through and did our home visits. And let me tell you, people, we had to write our court reports by hand. We hand wrote the court reports and then gave them to the office administrative assistants, there was about 4 or 5 in our office that would type them up for us. So those were not the good old days, I would say. So that's how I got started, and so ever since then, being, having that as my background as being a probation officer, I think has really instilled this idea of that when clients cause sexual harm, that they really do benefit from doing some restitution or something in that way. So let me just talk just a little bit about the basics of youth with sexual harm, or we call it PSB, which stands for problematic sexual behavior. That is not their identity. We do not want to label them as sex offenders, adolescent sex offenders, JSOs, juvenile sex offenders, because nobody's identity is really based on an event or in their history or by one particular problem. I particularly have a problem with being late sometimes. So I admire anybody that can start right at 11 o'clock on the dot. But I wouldn't want anybody calling me, always 10 minutes late, Sheryl. So please instill that in your language, and I think that's becoming more of the norm now. So we always use something called person-first language. So we want to think of them as a person first, and this applies to their parents and caregivers and even to the children that they've abused. So I'm trying to really get everyone away from using the term victim or survivor because, again, that's just one event in that child's life. It's not, their entire identity. So we talk about the youth with PSV and then the child who they abused, or their sibling or their cousin, or even use the child's name, the youth with PSV, and then, the abuse that he did to Sam. So to try to instill that these really are people, and we want to treat them as people. And even though it's so much simpler just to say, the JSO or the ASO that I'm working with, it takes about, 5 extra words, but we can all do it. Okay, so their brains are not developed. If anybody has a teenager or has a teenager at home, rest assured that someday they too will grow up and become more mature. And I have a son who's 25, and his name is Patrick. And so ever since he was a little boy, he always thought St. Patrick's Day was, especially his day. But this year, he stayed home on St. Patrick's Day because he's in grad school. So, the brain is finally developed and making good decisions and that kind of thing. So we really have stopped using the term grooming for youth. That still may apply to adults, but youth are much less likely to groom victims. I know that's still a popular belief that, these kids are, planning ahead and setting kids up and preparing to abuse them, and that does happen on occasion, but it's much more likely an impulsive kind of opportunistic event in which, maybe they have some ideas about it, and then all of a sudden they're in a situation where it would work out, and so they kind of go for it. It's not quite as much planning as we used to think, as well as they don't really have an ability to find non-sexual solutions to problems. Many people in the world, adults and kids included, use sexuality as a way to help themselves feel better, feel comfort, solve problems, reduce anxiety, those kinds of things. So we want kind of this really tricky balancing of thoughts and feelings. So when kids come into my office and they've committed a sexual offense or have been charged with some possible sexual assault kinds of things, we want to acknowledge the harm. So there's nothing good about sexual abuse. Even if it's done by a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, it's still not a positive thing. It's wrong, and it's illegal, and it's really, really hurtful to the other child, and we really need to acknowledge that harm. At the same time, they are still a young person, and they have a whole positive future that's waiting for them, and so we need to provide hope for that young person, that they can turn this around, they can accomplish treatment, they can be proud of trying to fix and make amends for their mistake. They can't be proud of their original behavior, but they can be proud of making some amends and getting through treatment and doing a good job that way. So many kids are scared to be involved in treatment, and that they're going to be shamed and punished, and, treatment is punishment. And so I really try to work in at least the very first session that this is not punishment. This is here to help you feel better, help you, resolve these issues and go on to have a good life. And that it's not just here to, remind you what a terrible person you are every session. So, but that's a difficult balance. That is pretty tricky to maintain. So the pinnacle of the treatment process for me anyway is something that in the therapeutic language we call clarification. And that is that we're clarifying what was done wrong instead of necessarily doing an apology. Apologies sometimes imply that it's expected with forgiveness in return, and so we don't want that to happen, so clarification word is used. But eventually, we want that young person to take full responsibility for their wrongdoing and understand why they did it. the understanding why is really important, because if they don't understand why, then they'll assume it's because they're a bad person, right? Because in a very concrete mind, bad people do bad things. So to take the idea that you can be a good person with lots of problems who do bad things, that's a much more complicated construct for teenagers and children that we want them to eventually come to understand in treatment. And so after clarification comes reparation. And so reparation comes from the root word repair. It's called restitution or restorative justice in kind of the juvenile justice literature. And so that means to, try to repair this mistake, which includes a verbal apology and then physically or concretely making amends in some way. And so I'll refer to something that I use with my clients called a reparation project. And we'll be talking about that as we're going forward today, and then creating a new normal, that there's going to be a new kind of set of rules in the family, a new set of boundaries, new ideas about sexuality, and then reunification happens some of the cases, sometimes not, kind of all depends on the situation. It's really hard to say. Most of the cases that I end up working with, but that's not to say a majority, because those are just the cases in my office, and that's not a random variable sample. But in cases of sibling incest, whenever I'm on a case, we at least work towards reunification between the siblings, because that is a great thing. So here's a little thing about being a sincere apology. And lots of times there are unsincere apologies, and we want whatever apology there to be real. It's not just a I'm sorry and kiss and make up and then we can go on with our lives and pretend nothing happened. So in the beginning, the goals for reparation for the youth with problematic sexual behavior is to have a way for them to prove that they are genuinely remorseful, that they really are sorry, that they understand that something was wrong, and that they want to make amends, and that this can begin the repair process between the relationship between the two kids, whether if it's family members, that's especially important. Sometimes I've seen situations happen between cousins or like next door neighbors, and if we can repair that process, it makes it a lot better for everyone. But that's not always possible. I have seen some kids that come in with so much guilt that they actually give themselves PTSD. So kind of the definition for PTSD is that they're not willing to talk about it, they're having flashbacks, and then they're having intrusive memories, and then some sort of behavior problems or behavior disturbances as a result of the flashbacks and thoughts. So we do have kids that just refuse to talk about it, can't go near it, are having flashbacks about the thing. And so they've actually given themselves PTSD from their own behavior because they have so much remorse and guilt about it, or from like how their family reacted perhaps after it was disclosed or discovered. Lots of kids are called pervert and sex offenders, and you're going to, be a pedophile just like so-and-so on TV, when their parents first find out about it, or caregivers, because they freak out, and reasonably so, but sometimes that causes a little hiccup in the treatment process, because if we can't get them to talk about it, we can't get them to heal from it. So there is this saying when working with trauma, is that from Dan Siegel, is that if it's shareable, it is bearable. So certainly we want youth with PSV to also be able to share and bear the burden of at least being able to tell the story. So that's one goal, is to reduce their guilt. And then the second goal, which is probably more important, is to make reparation and to help the child that was victimized. We want to create positive environment in the family, especially if siblings or cousins are involved. It can partially restore the balance after sexual harm. No amount of apologies or little projects are going to totally restore the balance, but it can partially restore the balance and meet some of those emotional needs that the child might have after being sexually abused. So there's pros and cons to this. It is doing this whole reparation project. You gotta, someone needs to be a leader of the process to make sure it happens. I mean, you gotta have some boldness and some creativity and just the ability to not give up and persistence, because lots of things will get in the way of this happening, and it's very difficult, and I use the clinical term yucky, but that's the closest I can get to, describing sexual abuse is just plain yucky, and talking about it from either the abuser side of the equation or from the being abused side of the equation, it's just simply yucky, and not a lot of people want to go there. Frankly, not a lot of therapists want to go there, and so they kind of skirt around the issue, and you really have to have some boldness and good judgment to know how far to go, how far to hold back, how far to push a kid, how far to push the caregivers, and it may not go well. I remember I was in the middle of a kid kind of explaining what had happened to his mom, because she was having a tough time accepting the fact that her child could have done something so terrible because she was abused in her childhood, and just couldn't put together that my child could be the same as my uncle, which they're not, but she had kind of equated those things in her mind. And this young man who was had sexually abused a neighbor was also sexually abused when he was 5, and then he sexually abused a neighbor at 11 or 12 or something. And so in the middle of this conversation, the mom blurts out, well, it's not your fault because you were sexually abused when you were 5. And I was like, oh, no, that's not where we want to go. But it had already gotten blurted out, and you have to come back from that and be like, well, and we had to kind of backtrack with that sometimes. So you have to be prepared for, even though you plan for this nice, happy, conversation about clarification to come up, lots of things can kind of get thrown in the way because you never know what some people will say. So for any of you that are outside of Omaha or don't normally read the Omaha World Herald, which, I'm in, way over 50, so I still read the paper. I know many of you don't, but I think it was March 7th in the Sunday paper, Michael Kelly had done an article about this that was called After Son Suicide, Ponca Hills Parents Turn Tragedy into Charity. And so that's the title of the article if you want to look it up on OWH.com, and basically what had happened, the picture here is a 9-year-old brother and a 5-year-old sister who were both sexually abused by a friend of the family who was 13 or 14 at the time. And basically what had happened is that the older teenager who abused the kids was in the RSAFE program back 10, 15 years ago, and had written letters to the kids explaining to them that he was at fault and it wasn't their fault, and that he was, taking responsibility for the sexual abuse and for the actions, because the 9-year-old brother saw him sexually abuse the 5-year-old little sister, and so felt responsible that he didn't stop it, that he could have done something. But he was only 9 and the other young man was 14. So anyway, the Michael Kelly interviewed the mom of the young man who committed the sexual abuse, and that mom said that she had heard from her son's counselor that the other parents refused to look at the letters. Although, 15 years later, the other mom said the letters were never offered, and that they really would have wanted the letters, and that they think it would have helped possibly prevent this young man's suicide, because he was sexually abused around 9 when all of this happened, and then at 21, just 4 or 5 months ago, I guess, he ended up completing a suicide and did die from that. So the two families were once close, but now, of course, there's a deep rift that remains. And, you know, it's just one family out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, but if we can possibly add one little domino or one little piece of information that helps a young person have a more positive life, it may not have been enough to have prevented a suicide, but if it's just possible to give them, you know, a few extra moments of happiness, then I think it's worth every amount of effort and myself as a provider to make sure that that family has access to those letters. And if they choose not to read them, that's fine, but that they're sitting in a drawer or sitting in somebody's file cabinet or sitting somewhere else where they have access to those letters if they want them in the future. So here are just kind of some typical I'm sorry statements, and this is not what we are looking for when we're asking a young person to take responsibility and to do a clarification or a reparation. So this is a phrase that sometimes people use, and that sorry doesn't cut it because sorry is used so often. And so I prefer the term I was wrong because that's really what we're asking is for these young people to take responsibility for doing something wrong. And then there is a book called The 5 Languages of Apology, which is written by the same author, Gary Chapman, and another person, I think, or maybe just Gary Chapman, who've written The 5 Languages of Love. And those are both very good books kind of in the relationship section of your local Barnes & Noble. But the 5 languages of apology is to express regret, accept responsibility, make restitution, like trying to do something to make it right, and genuinely repenting. You know, I'll try not to do that again. I really am sorry. And then the 5th apology language in the book is requesting forgiveness. And will you please forgive me? And again, we don't use that in this particular situation because sexual abuse is so serious that, you know, asking for forgiveness for sexual abuse seems a little trivial to me anyway. Requesting forgiveness for, you know, forgetting a birthday or, you know, drinking all of the orange juice, that's okay, but not for sexual abuse. So those are, we want to cover all 4 of those. The idea with the 5 languages is that different people prefer different things. So just to keep all of our bases covered, we're going to cover in a young person's clarification the top 4, and hopefully that will be what is needed for that young person who is sexually abused. So we do not ask for forgiveness. It's got lots of emotional baggage attached to forgiveness. And I believe true forgiveness is offered naturally and not requested. It also may put too much pressure on a child to forgive. I've seen, you know, kids 5 or 6-year-olds say, okay, that's fine, no problem. You know, sexually abused me for 2 years. And then, you know, once they hit 15 or 16 and they really realize how serious sexual abuse was, all that forgiveness goes right out the door. And so just because there is forgiveness, it doesn't mean all is good. And, you know, people are ready to live their lives as if nothing has happened. That's probably the biggest struggle that I see with caregivers. Not so much the kids, but especially the caregivers. They just want it to be over. They just want it to be over. They just, let's get this done, and then we can pretend like it never happened. And so they're taking on and accepting what really happened with their child is one of the biggest struggles, and that's why I've worked so much with caregivers in the past. So here is my kind of little diagram for rationale for reparation. Excuse me. If it goes well, and again, that's a big if, there really is a ripple effect because there's healing for the abused person. It reduces the shame for the person who's done the abusing after repairing the mistake. It gives the caregivers and families a lot of hope that, you know, things are going to be okay again. We're going to be able to get through this type of trauma in our family, and it really is a thrill as a provider. I mean, those are the days I cannot wait to get to work, and afterwards I'm just kind of walking around the office. There's about 10 other therapists in my office at Woodhaven, and I'm like, guess what happened today? I got to do a reparation. Guess what happened today? I got to do a reparation. It went really well, and people are crying and happy, and I'm like, making those tiger, I don't know what you would call it, but that move that Tiger Woods makes after he, gets a good putt or something, the pumping of the arm and the, like, yes, I did it. This is the coolest thing on earth. And that doesn't happen very often, so I really, revel in that moment for a long time, frankly. And then, I can go on and kind of share, even if I don't share any details of the family, I can, just telling friends and family and the community at large, I had a great day at work. I work with sexual abuse, but it can work out. It can, there can be healing in families. And just that idea provides, a much better understanding that youth with problematic sexual behaviors can be helped. They aren't automatically doomed to being adult sex offenders and that kind of thing. So I believe that ripple effect kind of goes far and wide. And hopefully just all of you today, just hearing me talk about it will kind of have maybe a glimpse of hope when you hear about situations or have cases that walk into your office that maybe this kid too can, make reparation for his mistake. So the reparation project is more than apology. It really is proof that the person is remorseful and they want to make amends. I had one younger sister said, this is the first time my brother ever did anything just for the benefit of me. Because it really is kind of personalized to make restitution that will benefit the child that they abused. And we can't always have contact with the child who is abused, but if possible, it really does benefit them a lot to have the person that personally abused them write them a letter or say to them in person, it is not your fault. It's my responsibility, and you did nothing wrong. That goes 100 times farther than 100 therapists or adults or caregivers or grandparents saying you did nothing wrong, sweetie, you did nothing wrong, sweetie. But to have the person who did it to you say the same thing is worth more than all of that. So a couple of examples of a young man who had sexually abused two stepsisters, I believe, is that he was 17 years old and had some money, and so he took them to Build-A-Bear. And if any of you have been to Build-A-Bear, that would be like torture for a 17-year-old boy to stand in line at Build-A-Bear, but that was what the girls wanted, and he was willing to do that. And then in the process of building a bear, you put a little heart in the bear, I think. And so both he and the little sisters put a little wish or kiss the heart and wish for, healthy sibling relationships. And then they put the heart in the bear and sewed it up, and they all got to name it and do the whole process. So it was, a whole afternoon kind of thing. But that was really special and important and meaningful to that particular family. There was this obviously is just a picture off of Google, but there was a young man who was not able to have contact with the child that he abused. So what he did is that he shared his apology letter with the forensic interviewer at here in Omaha's Project Harmony. So he met with the person who had interviewed the little girl and heard all about her abuse, and then he read the letter and did the apology with the forensic interviewer in order to state, I am sorry, what she said was true, it wasn't her fault, and this is where I'm at. And I think I heard from that forensic interviewer is that, it did make a difference. It gave her a little more hope about believing that, these young people who do sexual things to younger kids, are all criminals per se. Not that their acts aren't criminal because they are illegal, but that, her belief was that, they should all be, put in jail to a certain degree. And so it gave her a little bit of hope that maybe not all of them deserve to be in jail. So let's get back to what being a teenager is really like. So this is a little cartoon from Zitz, which is my favorite cartoon about teenage boys. Let's face it, they don't really have an easy way to talk about feelings. You know, the most we can get out of them is that they talk about feeling hungry. And so it's really hard for them to connect with those feelings of guilt and remorse. If they do connect with it, it's usually done for me with an exercise or activity or a worksheet or a drawing or, something that they can, fill in the blank and write out sentences or something. They just don't sit in my office and say, oh, gee, Sheryl, I was really feeling, sad and remorseful today when, I was having these feelings and I dreamt about this. That does not happen. So we have to remember that especially young men, there is that moral development there that goes on a continuum from I will do this because I'm in trouble and you told me to, and then at the other end of the continuum is that I'll do this because it's the right thing to do. And that moral development of I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do really doesn't happen until adulthood, like 21 if you're lucky, more likely 22, 23, 24. So we need to keep that in mind and checking our expectations that we're not asking more of these kids and their apologies and restitution or reparations that they can really accomplish. So taking a kid to Build-A-Bear and kissing on a heart is, for that previous example, was like as good as it gets. It's not going to be this mushy-gushy, heartfelt, kind of apology. So the first step of the reparation process is what I call orientation, and that's where we're just going to introduce the idea at the very first sessions. We want to make sure that that family has hope. Parents love this idea. A lot of parents have taken their kids back to the grocery store to return the, pack of gum that they, put in their pocket when they were 5 years old. And so, those parents especially love the idea that they're going to do something to make up for their mistake, especially if there hasn't been any jail time or time spent in the youth detention center. Then sometimes people feel like, well, they got off scot-free because all they have to do is go to therapy. Well, there's more to therapy than just sitting and playing games and talking about your feelings. So that's helpful, and that, there's all different types of reparation. So it could be an apology. It could be, doing a reparation project. It could be with, other people involved in the case, or it can be with the child that was actually abused. So another couple examples is that another young man who was not able to do reparation with the child he abused is that he was their family, and he was too, were very strong Catholics. And so he did extra chores on Grandpa's farm. And for all of you in rural Nebraska, I'm glad you're here. I actually grew up in Kearney, so God knows there's always work to do on a farm. And so he did extra work on Grandpa's farm and then went and talked to the priest at his church and donated the money to the church and talked to the priest and kind of did an apology, reparation / confession, so to speak. But it wasn't official confession. It was more like a counseling session with the priest to acknowledge the harm that he had caused and what he was trying to do and what he hoped the church would do with his money, to help other kids in the parish and that kind of thing. And then there was another brother who had done a shadow box for his sibling who he abused and organized all of her ribbons and trophies and different things that she had gotten from sports. And anybody who has little kids in soccer or basketball, every single season you get a medal or, a 2-inch tall trophy or whatever it is. And that's really important to little kids. Just for participating, you get a medal. So he had taken those and organized all of those for her, and then she could display that in her room, and she was very proud that her brother had done that for her. Okay, so the second step of the reparation process is this clarification thing that happens in therapy. A really important part of that clarification is to, as a therapist who's working with a young man with PSB, is that you really need to know the other side of the story and then determine like the semi-coherent narrative of the abuse. If you believe what the youth with PSB says 100%, you're only going to get half of the truth, even with the most conscientious, I can't say that word, but, with the kids who are really trying hard, I guess. They're just not able to tell you the other side of the story, and so frankly they don't. So it's really important to kind of get the other side of the story, whether it comes from the other child's therapist or a victim advocate or a police report or something. And if possible, the youth with PSP can help answer questions of the child that he abused to help him or her in treatment. But that is the first part of reparation, is doing that clarification. Absolutely no excuses. I don't care if you've been abused by 15 other people. That does not give you the right to sexually abuse another child. And I don't care if you've, watched pornography for 5,000 hours. That does not give you the right to sexually abuse other people. So we don't want to ruin the apology with an excuse. So the youth must take full responsibility. They made a choice. Now, they may have been lots of reasons behind that choice, which may kind of help us adults understand, but they really do need to take full responsibility for making that choice on that day at that particular time was the wrong choice. And caregivers sometimes need to also take responsibility. I've had lots of parents in my office tell me, well, we knew he had this problem when he was 7, but we never got counseling, and now he's 17 and still having the same problem. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it would have been so much easier to solve this when he was 7. But, caregivers are doing the best that they can. They're not intentionally keeping that kid out of counseling so he'll do it again. They're just hoping it's not that big of a deal, and then it does turn into a bigger deal. In those cases, that caregiver does need to take a small portion of the responsibility, not the whole responsibility, but a small portion of it, and at least acknowledge the regret that, they probably should have done something sooner in taking ownership of that part themselves, which again takes a lot of work in a therapy setting, and that caregiver may need his or her own therapy to do that as well. So all youth, unless they're not a psychopath or a sociopath or very, very seriously conduct disorders, any human being is going to feel shame for doing sexual abuse to another person if they understand how serious sexual abuse is. So that's actually, the guilt is a good thing because they've done something wrong, but the heavy burden of shame is what we want to kind of prevent. So this is what I call the river of shame, which is this unhealthy shame, which is the, I'm not worth anything, I'm no good, I'm never going to amount to anything, and what this has done is ruin my life forever. That's the unhealthy amount of shame. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for their ability to forgive themselves. On this day, I committed this act, and it was wrong, and accepting the wrongdoing, and it was all my fault. And then the reparation part is that I can make it better, and I can go on to have a good life, and maybe I can even help the person that I abused to go on to have a better life. And so I use this diagram because a lot of kids we work with have kind of cognitive disabilities, or, they just don't really kind of get it verbally, or nonverbal learning disorders is what I call it, like the kids who can talk really good, but then when you're trying to talk to them, it looks like, the light's on, but nobody's home. They just, it's hard for them to understand the concepts sometimes verbally. And those kids, a lot of them have nonverbal learning disabilities, which basically means, that there's something else in their brain that interferes with their ability to understand a concept, even though they can read and talk and have an IQ of 110, that there's other things going on. So anyway, this picture helps a lot with those kids and with caregivers especially. So with caregivers with sibling incest cases, I have a special I don't know what you would call it. I just make them do this. I just say, before we can move further, we have to do this thing. And so What it is that I take the caregivers and the two siblings, if they have contact and if it works out in the situation, and there's lots of other details to make this happen, but to have the caregivers in the same room with the two kids involved in the sibling sexual abuse. And I have both caregivers, if possible, if they're married and that kind of thing, say in front of both kids is that we support and are going to provide safety for the sibling who was abused, and, we love this person, and we love the usually the older sibling, and we are going to support this older sibling and get treatment for the sibling who did the abusing. And they say both things in front of both kids at the same time. And so then there's no question that the parents are walking, or the caregivers are walking this tightrope of providing support and love for both kids at the same time, holding the older child accountable and providing safety for the younger child. So if it gets down to it, and the abuse is continuing, then safety comes first. But we're going to get this older child, or the child who did the abusing, lots of counseling so that that doesn't happen. And that seems to be kind of a turning point for a lot of families, that, everybody knows what everybody else has heard from the caregivers. And then that it kind of eliminates some of that sibling rivalry things. Okay, so planning the reparation process is that takes a lot of planning. And again, this is where your persistence as whoever is the kind of project manager of this idea comes forth, is that we don't want whatever is chosen to cause any flashbacks or remind the child of the abuse in any way. It requires time, money, and effort on the part of the child who did the abusing, and plus the needs of the victimized child is taken into consideration. So it can be lots of different things. It can get very creative, but we want to make sure that it goes as smoothly as possible. There always needs to be some sort of formal apology written down. I demand that it be written down, and again, and I shouldn't say really demand, because I do it very in a nice way, that we can't move forward until it's done. So I suppose that's technically a demand, but we can't move forward until this is done, because someday these kids are likely to forget about this one session that we had, or when this apology was written, especially when they get really mad at each other over, who knows what, in 10 years. And so I want it written down and kept in a private place, and in my file, so that there can be really acknowledgement that it really is genuine. If you write something down, it means you're more committed to it. And all the lawyers, I'm sure, would agree. We don't sign documents for houses and wills just on, a handshake. We always write that down and sign our name to it to make it official. And so I really want these kind of apology things to be official, and the offer to make amends is part of that. So we again, get away from using the word apology, because sometimes that is kind of used too much. And so this is an accountability letter to a parent. And this is written by a 8th grader. And here again is an example of a kid with a normal IQ, but if you notice, has really difficult spelling. And so I'm going to read this just so you know what it says. And this would be another example of probably a nonverbal learning disability that I don't think was ever diagnosed. But here's what it says. I got to take a drink here. Okay, to Mom. I'm sorry for hurting, I believe it was a younger cousin, in a sexual way. It was not his fault for what I did, and I take full responsibility for what happened. I don't know how you felt when you knew but you probably felt confused and mad and didn't want to see me. But I like how you support me by taking me to therapy and talking to me when I'm sad or mad. So you know if I'm okay. But now I'm in therapy, so I can talk about what happened to me and what I did to my cousin. and I'm learning how to keep kids younger than me safe. But I'm happy how our relationship has changed by not fighting a lot and getting to hug a lot more. Okay, so that was, in the beginning phases of clarification, reparation, we have these conversations between the child with the PSB and his or her caregiver before we move on to sharing those same sorts of responsibility statements with the child who was abused. So this reparation process is an extra step. It's lots of extra work, but I do believe there's extra benefits. And another way it benefits is I had a family where they had been reunified and they had they'd done apology sessions, but they didn't do like this official reparation project or anything. They just had a lot of family sessions, and actually the kids had stayed together the whole time. It's kind of depending on the cases, but sometimes the youth aren't removed from the family depending on situations. But anyway, the caregivers were reporting to me that the little sister was basically tattling all the time on the older brother and getting him in trouble for all sorts of kind of, really innocent, piddly things, and they were really annoyed. And so we kind of thought about maybe she was like really trying to get revenge on her older brother. Even though he had said he was sorry, it must not have been enough for her, and wondering if it kind of went back to, the sexual abuse where she felt, kind of this imbalance in the family, and she had to get back at him because he didn't actually get brought up on any charges in court or any of that kind of stuff, which is a whole nother story. But anyway, so we always want to use the emotional and physical needs of the child who is abused as a guideline for decisions. So in this particular family, we decided that what we needed to do was a reparation project. And so we worked with this is the same case. The older brother decided he was going to build a shelf for the little sister. And oh my gosh, she had more details about how she wanted the shelf, and she wanted it this way and she wanted it that way, but we followed everything she said. And luckily there was another relative in the family who had a woodworking shop in his garage, and so this young man was able to scrape up some money and went to the uncle's house and built this shelf to every specification of the little sister. And then after that was installed in her room, and we took pictures and kind of talked about how he isn't just doing this because you're tattling on him, where he's doing this to help that he really is sorry and that kind of stuff. And then after that was done, this kind of tattling and kind of underlying conflictual stuff between the siblings stopped. So so that's one example of a reparation project. And then another example is a young man who went on a family outing because it was two cousins. And so the two families all went together to the zoo, and then the child who had done the sexual abuse, this is, again, not a child. I think that's an adult. This is just a picture off of Google. But, was never alone with the younger cousin at the zoo. They were always together in a group, but then helped them pick out something in the gift shop at the end of the day to symbolize that, this whole outing was for you so that you could be happy and know that, I want us to be together as a family and, again, create a new relationship. And that was a really nice thing. So making meaning is the last step, and I put on this picture of a roller coaster because this is how I feel when we do these projects and really document what has happened and can praise all the people involved. And we always have cake. I don't know, that might be more for my benefit than theirs, but we have dessert of some kind. One time we had root beer floats. That was really great. So I'd get that excited over root beer floats alone. So that's making meaning of the project, and then preparing for the future, especially if a child who is abused is not in treatment. There probably will be issues that are coming up in the future. So even if they can't provide letters for some reason to that child at the time, they need to have them on hold, ready to go, in somebody's file cabinet so that that child can document or access them later and then keeping documentation of things in the future. So we really are hoping that balance is restored in the family and maybe even our community, because again, it's a way to kind of emotionally take care of those things. So I think we're about done with the PowerPoint. So kind of the question is, what can you do to help facilitate this as probation officers? It all depends on how cases are worked in your area. And if restitution is always assigned, if we can do restitution where it has some meaning, or even if they're picking up trash on the side of the highway, we can still figure out a way to make meaning of it so that that child knows that they're not just picking up trash for the judge's sake. They're picking up trash to repair their mistake and to prove that they're sorry, and then we can take a photo of that and, send it to somebody and say, this is what I did, to acknowledge that I did something wrong, and that, it wasn't just because I was told to. So looks like we have about 10 minutes. I know I talked super fast because I wanted to make sure we had time for questions at the end. So I see people are typing. So let me see if, does anybody have questions? Tom says, are there professionals current in the RSAFE process towards the western part of the state? There is an RSAFE therapist in Lincoln, but unfortunately that is, I think, as far western as we go. There's lots of other therapists that work with these types of populations that live in other parts of the state. I don't know that they're familiar with this reparation process like I do. We're trying to do more training of therapists, and that's why I was took a different role within the RSAFE program in Omaha, and right now we've got 10 therapists that we're training to do kind of counseling the RSAFE way, so to speak, or at least, share with them all that we do, and that's a year-long process, so those folks can, contact me and we can get them signed up for another thing. So the time frame on the reparation process, it all depends on the situation. I talk about it at the beginning of counseling, and then when we get time to do it, it usually takes maybe a month or two. Families seem to drag this on because they just are avoiding the uncomfortable facing the elephant in the room kind of thing. And so I've had to say to several families, well, we're not going to do another session until you've made some progress on this, bookshelf idea. So let me know when you get that done, and then we can schedule another appointment. And so sometimes we really have to push them on that. No, not a month or two for each step, probably clarification, depending on how much shame there is, to get a child to admit and take full responsibility may take months and months. But after they're able to take that responsibility, then it goes pretty quickly, maybe 5-6 sessions between taking responsibility, yes, I know I did something wrong, to, okay, so what do you want to do to make up for it? Here I've talked to this person and that person. Peg Stevens, hi Peg, I think if you're the same one, I know you, is the reparation process a recognized professional peer review standard for therapeutic restitution? It is not. If anybody likes to do research and wants to do research on this, I would be happy to do that. It is not. Apology letters are pretty standard. Almost every treatment program that is well known in the country, and we've worked a lot with Oklahoma University, they definitely do apology letters, but they do apology letters and share them with caregivers, and they don't always share them with the child that was abused. So that's probably more of my idea, but I'm actually going to Minnesota here next month to do a training on reparation, and so I'm hoping to kind of get the idea flowing, and then hopefully somebody can take it on and do some research on it and see if it actually helps. The little bit that I've done, I will say, So, Johnny, you've taken you've admitted that you're wrong, so how big is your shame? And they'll say 7. Okay, and then we do the apology, and the shame comes down to 5. Okay, which is good, pretty good if it's 5. And then we do the reparation project, and then I say, so how big is your shame now? And then it goes down to a 2. And so that's just a little bit of feedback that I've gotten from my clients, is that it really does reduce their shame. And if I don't have access to the children who've been abused to really find out how much it benefits them. So it is, so PEGAS, again, if it's incorporated by all the RSAFE therapists here in Omaha, they all know about it, but it's kind of up to each therapist in each family to decide if they want to do it or not. But certainly I've given everybody there all of my information, and we're trying to, kind of get those projects happening. But it's not, a lot of factors have to come into play. So LaDonna says, is this a restorative justice type of approach, but for youth with PSP? Yes, I would say so, definitely. This is what I would call restorative justice. I really first got the idea from a lady named Joanne Schladale, who's from Maine, and she does a lot with restorative, does she call it restorative justice? Yes. And so certainly there are some articles on restorative justice. So I would say yes, it is.
Thank you, Sheryl, for your expertise and Lutheran Family Services for partnering in this training. Your work is so vital to such a vulnerable population. I would encourage those attending today to check out SherylOverby.com and her Facebook page, Sheryl Overby Counseling. And remember, that is Sheryl with an S. For those of you joining on this event, thank you. And please watch for more announcements of upcoming NJJA-sponsored web-based training events on a variety of topics. This concludes our presentation. And we encourage you to also plan your schedule so you can attend the annual NJJA conference to be held again in Kearney, Nebraska on May 17, 18, and 19 of this year. And on behalf of everyone at the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association, thank you.